First things first, why would you even want to buy a piece of lumber like this from a sawmill that's just rough when you can buy S4S lumber at a lumber yard like this? That means surfaced four sides. You've got one flat bottom, the top surface is also flat, but it's parallel to the bottom. The edges are square to both faces, and I've actually ripped it on a table saw so that one edge is parallel to the other. The most obvious reason to buy rough lumber is cost. It's probably a quarter to a third of the cost of buying it already surfaced. And yeah, you got to take some time to do it, but it's going to save you a lot of money. Other benefits to purchasing lumber and milling it yourself are going to be you're going to get much better color matching, grain patterns, the texture of the lumber. It's all going to be a lot better match because when you go to the sawmill and you're picking the boards off of a skid, they most likely came from the same log or the same tree. So they're going to have a much better consistent color throughout the entire skid of boards that you pick through at the sawmill. Now, you can buy a piece like this at a big box store. The problem is you buy it and it looks straight and it looks flat. When you take it home, it simply will not stay that way. That's due to the differences in the humidity of the store where you bought it and the humidity in your shop at home. And if there's any differences, which there inevitably will be, that board is either going to release moisture or absorb moisture from the environment in your shop. When it does, it will twist, it will cup, it will do different things, and the board will no longer be straight. In order to mill lumber at home, you're going to need a couple of machines. And yes, I know you can do this all different ways. My preference is to have at least a 6-inch jointer and a 13-inch thickness planer. The thickness planer that I recommend the most is the DeWalt 735. I think it's the absolute best one for a home shop. If you want to know why, maybe I'll produce a video on that. Leave me a comment down below, and if I get enough comments, then maybe I'll produce a video for that too. The sooner you get a jointer and a planer, the sooner you're going to start saving money, the sooner you're going to have fewer frustrations, and the sooner you're going to have just higher quality projects that you're able to produce in your shop. Probably the most important first step to milling your own lumber at home is to do absolutely nothing. And what I mean by that is be very patient once you bring that lumber home from the sawmill. So when you get it home, you're going to want to stack and sticker it. And make some hardwood stickers that are 3/4 of an inch square out of some scraps in your shop. And what you're going to do is set a layer of those on the floor and get your first layer of lumber on it. You want air flowing to all sides of that piece of lumber. Put your next layer on top. Make sure those stickers are right over top of each other. You want all of the weight to stay in the same location so that your boards stay as flat as possible while they are acclimating to your shop. And this is what's referred to as acclimating. You want those boards to start to come to equilibrium with the humidity level in your shop. Once you've got all your boards stacked up, the next thing you want to do is check the moisture content of one of them. Do that with a moisture meter. Write it down. Keep track of the moisture content of your stack of lumber about every 2 or 3 days, and don't ever mill it for at least 2 weeks. I like to wait between 2 and 4 weeks minimum until I start to mill any of the boards. If you do it too soon, and if the moisture content isn't at equilibrium with the surroundings in your shop, you can mill that lumber. It'll seem like it's going to be straight. It looks straight, but it'll dry out a little bit more after a few days, and then it's going to cup and twist and bow and do crazy things. And you're going to have some stock that's going to be too thin to use in one of your projects. So be patient and let that lumber acclimate to your shop for at least 2 weeks. While you wait for the lumber to acclimate, what you can do is take some chalk and start to draw and label the different project pieces on your boards. And that way you're going to be able to know where they all go or where they're all going to come from, and it'll speed up your process of the layout once you get to that stage of actually breaking down the lumber and milling it. A couple of the things you're going to want to do is allow at least 4 inches or about 4 inches at the end of each board where you're going to get planer snipe. That area that we call planer snipe is actually a little bit thinner than what your actual thickness is going to be once you surface it through your planer. So just know that that's going to end up being waste, okay? And allow 4 inches at both ends of the board. Another thing you're going to want to do is identify any problem areas in different pieces of lumber that you've got as well, because you may not be able to use this full width along the full length of the board. This is a good example here. There's actually a check that goes right through this board, and it comes right to about there. Okay, so there's a check on the end that goes all the way to here. Now, I'm just going to draw a little tick right here and follow it along. But what you see is that check goes all the way over to like here. Okay, so you might only get a full length board that is only, say, this wide right here because of that check, or a really narrow one along the other side. But you're not going to get a 5 or a 6 inch wide board that's as long as this entire one because of that check. You're also going to want to identify areas you just simply don't want to use. Like you may not want anything to do with this knot because the grain's going to be kind of gnarly and swirly through there, and you might get a lot of tear out or something. You can see that on the other side right here where I actually ran this through the jointer. There's a bunch of tear out all in this area, right in here. So that's going to be a problem if you're trying to get the board plane nice and smooth for a project. So you might say to yourself, you know what, there's a check here, there's weird swirly grain here. I may want to just cut this board off right there and make my project pieces come from that portion. But that doesn't give you a whole lot of clear space on this board because that one check comes into here, which really only gives you a clear spot in the middle of about maybe 14 or 15 inches. So some boards are going to be like that from the sawmill, but when you take a look at them and lay them out that way, you'll start to see where pieces can actually come from. And this is just a random piece of wood I had laying around that I thought would be a good example to show you things like that, because you don't want to count on that being part of your tabletop when you've got defects all through that piece. So pay attention to that and mark those out while you're actually waiting for the lumber to acclimate. Let's talk a little bit more about laying out your project pieces. Let's say, for example, you have a whole bunch of maybe nightstands you want to build, and you have a whole bunch of aprons to make. So one way to lay it out on a board of this size might be to make a cut here. Okay, so just imagine that this piece is in 2 pieces, and you got to allow for 4 inches of snipe on the end. You've got your project piece for the apron, let's say it's 16 inches, and more snipe. And with the other piece, you've also got snipe, your apron, and more snipe. That essentially gives you, no extra material on this board to use for any other pieces in the project. A more efficient way to lay it out would be not make that cut in the middle, okay? And like this side of the board. So you've got your snipe on the end, butt the 2 aprons up to each other, and have your snipe on the other end here. That's going to give you a piece of extra material that you can use for something else in the project. So a little less wasteful if you just think about how you lay things out. And in this case, you're not going to cross cut it there. You're going to leave it the full length, and you're going to have one apron right up against the next one. So essentially you're only getting 8 inches of waste with the snipe at this end and at this end. Another milling tip that I'll give you that I kind of learned the hard way early on is, let's pretend that a piece needs to be 2.5 inches wide, like maybe in the case of the table aprons that I was just talking about a few moments ago. So I've laid this board out a little bit differently because it's a little over 5 inches thick. So I've drawn a line down the middle here to allow for a 2.5 inch apron and another 2.5 inch apron. Now, when you go and cut those pieces, they're not going to stay straight this way. They're going to bow in this fashion or in this fashion, and you're going to need to re-straighten them. So you're going to need to allow extra width in all your project pieces before you get to the final dimensions. Allow at least 1/4 inch, if not even 3/8, and if it's a longer piece, even allow an extra 1/2 inch in the width. The other thing is, you're also not going to want to thickness your material to your final thickness either. If the thickness of a project piece calls for 3/4 inch, do not mill it all the way down to 3/4 inch thick in the first milling session. You want to leave it too thick to begin with because, once again, as you start to cut those pieces out of the board, they're going to cup, they're going to twist, they're going to bow, and you're probably going to need to flatten one face again and re-thickness it to your final dimension of 3/4 of an inch once you've got your project piece kind of rough cut to size. Once your lumber's properly acclimated to your shop and the moisture levels have been consistent for a little while, then it's time to start breaking down the lumber. Now, you've got cross cuts to make and rip cuts to make. The cross cuts, make sure you take into account the planer snipe on the ends of the boards or the pieces, and make those cuts with a miter saw, a circular saw, a jigsaw. Those are 3 very safe ways to do it. Don't use a table saw. Okay, you don't have any straight square reference surfaces to do a safe cut on a table saw cross cutting, and you certainly can't rip them on the table saw either. I prefer to use a circular saw or the miter saw. It's a great fast, safe way to do it when I'm doing those cross cuts, but when I rip them, I prefer the band saw for a few reasons. Extremely safe, no chance of kickback if the kerfs close, but also it's a much thinner kerf blade than a table saw blade, so you're going to be making less waste. When I do a big project like a Rubo bench build, for example, where I've got lots of lumber to mill, I always make sure that I get the in-feed and out-feed tables of my jointer waxed up, and I just use some paste wax, automotive paste wax. So let's get that done. It'll make the pieces that you're going to start to mill slide across the table much easier with way less effort. I always like to put a little bit on the fence too, because once you start to joint the edges to square the edge to the face, you want that piece to slide nice and effortlessly across that fence. And this whole process only takes just a minute or 2. And that's all there is to it. A couple quick minutes and you're done. The next thing you want to do after waxing the tables is make sure your fence is square to your tables. You don't want to go and mill up your lumber and find after the fact that it's just not square, so just make sure that it's good and square. Check it in a few places, but this looks really tight all the way along that fence. Yeah, so we're good to go. Here's one of the pieces of the legs that's going to get laminated together to make some really thick bench legs. But the first thing we're going to look for is which side of the board is concave, like this. And that's the side that's going to go down on the jointer bed. And the reason for that is when you put it on the jointer bed, it's not going to want to rock. It's going to sit nice and stable against this high spot and this high spot. Okay? If you were to put it the other way, that piece of lumber is actually going to want to rock like a rocking horse leg on that jointer bed, and it's not going to be stable. You're not going to get flat stock that way. So you absolutely have to put that cupped side down on the jointer bed. The next thing you're going to want to pay attention to is which direction are you going to feed it through the jointer. So you need to know which way the grain is actually running. And sometimes in order to do that, you've got a rough edge that was from the sawmill. You can't really see the grain. So if you've got a block plane in your shop, just run it across the board a little bit, and that'll help to reveal the grain and the direction. Okay, so you'll see on this one, the grain is actually running for the most part right here like this. So it's kind of running off to your right on the screen of the video. Okay, so when we've got that going over the surface of the jointer, we know that the cutter head on that jointer actually spins clockwise, and we're going to want that clockwise cutter head to be cutting downhill like this. So we know we want that board to feed from the screen that you're watching, from the right side of the screen to the left, the same way you would run it through the jointer at home in your shop. So this will be down, and we're going to feed it towards the left. My jointer is only 6 inches wide, so I've actually just marked off a line right here that's 6 inches from the other edge. And I'm just going to rip that on the bandsaw. That's a really nice, safe way to break down some lumber, and then it'll be able to go through my jointer nice and easy. So when you run the board through the jointer, here's the pencil lines I drew a few moments ago, and they're all running downhill to the right. That cutter head actually spins clockwise, like I said, so you want to feed the board through from right to left. One of the tips when you're running boards through the jointer is you want to make sure that you don't put any pressure really down on the infeed side. It's only going to be on the outfeed side. That'll make sure that after the board passes through, it stays nice and flat and level with this reference surface that's actually nice and parallel to the 12 o'clock position on that cutter head. Pushing it through on the infeed, but pushing it down on the outfeed. So let's get some safety glasses on and run this through. So that's got the one face of this piece of maple nice and flat all the way on the whole surface from one end to the other. So the next step is going to be edge jointing this board so that you can have one edge nice and straight. This is the face that we already just milled up nice and flat on the jointer, but similarly when we looked at the edge to know which way to run the board through for the face, you want to look at the face now to see how this grain direction is actually going on the face. So it's kind of running uphill to the right. Now, because this face is going to go against the fence, sometimes people get mixed up a little bit. So I like to kind of just draw on the other side that's not actually face jointed yet, which way that grain direction is going, so that when I flip that face onto the fence, I can see that it's running down to the right, the same way that we actually did the face jointing a few moments ago. So let's run this board through and we'll straighten this edge, and that is going to give us not just a straight edge, but it'll also give us a nice 90-degree corner right here on this board. Once again, safety glasses on, hearing protection on. Now I am getting a little bit of tear out on this piece, so I just kind of drew it out right here. I think you can probably see it. Yeah, and that's because the grain direction is kind of swirly. It's doing a few odd things right there where it's kind of coming down and back up. So I'll just take a light pass or two, and that should come right out of there. That's perfect. No tear out with a light pass at the end. Once you end up putting a square on that to see how well you did, you should find that you got a perfect 90 degrees, which we do. Now you're essentially going to do the same thing to all of the boards that you're going to be milling, but you might run into one like this leg of the Rubo bench, where when you put that cupped side down, like I showed you with the first one, it actually does want to rock because the board is actually twisted a little bit along its length and this corner is kind of up. Okay, so when you run that one through the jointer, you want to make sure that you stabilize it as much as you can and keep one edge on that jointer bed. I'll show you right now. This particular board seems to sit really, really flat along this back edge. So that's the area where I'm going to try and keep the pressure down, and I'm going to try and keep the pressure off of this corner because this is that corner that wanted to rock. It was up off the table saw. So let's run it through, keeping pressure against the board along where the fence area is with this one. So as you slowly work this face flat, you're going to start to have a wider and wider section of a flat reference face, and then it'll expand out here and it'll get wider and wider here as well. So a few more passes and this will be nice and flat, but right now it's actually staying pretty stable on the jointer. But let's keep going. All right, so after a few passes, you've got another face nice and flat. So we'll edge joint it next. Make sure you keep the board nice and tight against the fence and the table with no gaps. Now, with this other piece for a leg here, even though I've got it with the cup side down, it's up off the table here, and it's up off the table on that far right corner. So what we're gonna do is we're gonna use a hand plane to take down this high spot here and the high spot underneath this end right here. So every once in a while, you may need to get your hand planes out in order to do some stuff. Okay, so we're not perfect, but we're very close. It's only maybe a 1/16 of an inch of rock there, so we can probably run that through the jointer and be okay now. When it comes to running your lumber through the planer, remember the cutter head's on the top, but it also spins clockwise, very similar to the jointer, but we're gonna feed it through on this left-hand side through to the right. We'll put the jointed side flat down on the planer bed, and because that cutter head is spinning clockwise, I've got the grain oriented so that it's running uphill to the left. So I've set all of my lumber on my cart here so that in general, there's some swirly knots and weird things here and there, but in general, the grain is running uphill to the left. So when that cutter head comes across it, we don't get tear out from one end of the board to the other. After you've got your parts thicknessed with your planer, what you're going to want to do is get them to a rough width. So in the case of my Rubo bench, the legs are actually 5 3/8 of an inch wide. I'm going to rip them to a rough width of 5 9/16 of an inch wide because they're probably still going to move a little bit, maybe cup or twist or bow end to end. So I'm going to make them a little bit oversized so that if they do happen to move a little bit after I've ripped them, I can still re-straighten them on the jointer and then re-rip them to the final width, and then I'll have a nice, perfect, straight leg to work with. There's a few pieces in this soft maple that are going to be great for the legs. This one piece right here has some really nice color. I'm going to end up putting that probably right on the front of the bench where I see it all the time. After you have everything rough milled to width and thickness, you're going to want to stack it up and let some air flow through it with some stickers. The purpose of this is to let that lumber acclimate one more time to your shop. So you've made it thinner, you've made it narrower, you've released some tension in the wood, you've allowed some of the areas in the center of the board that theoretically have a higher moisture content to be more exposed or closer to the surface of the lumber. So it's going to want to cup or twist or move a little bit. So by allowing some airflow through each layer, it's going to let that happen. Hopefully it doesn't. Hopefully your milling is going to be very simple from here on in, but at least if you've allowed an extra bit of width and a bit of extra thickness, then you're going to have some extra material to be able to re-flatten on the jointer, re-thickness with your planer, and also rip again on the table saw to the width that you need. So typically 1 or 2 days is all you need. I tend to only work on the weekends, so I'm going to leave it for a week. I'll come back to this next Saturday or Sunday and carry on from there. Now, either go watch another one of my woodworking videos or go build something beautiful.